You heard our conversation yesterday, full of tension and hostility, although I was so tired of these scenes that I almost stopped noticing them. It was another cold, jerky dialogue between me and my mother-in-law, whose voice oozed disdain. My eldest son and his wife are coming home for the birth of a child, so I need you to take your things out into the yard, she said dryly, avoiding eye contact. I'm sorry, you can't have children anyway, so why do you need the space? Those words, sharp as a dagger, pierced my soul painfully. I couldn't answer right away, fighting the muffled scream inside me. You're not helping with my son's work, she continued, her tone becoming almost businesslike, as if it was about something insignificant. So the least you could do is free up some room. My indignation began to turn into anger. But I'm paying $20,000 for rent, I objected, trying to keep my voice calm, even though resentment was boiling inside me. Living in this house with such a hostile atmosphere has become unbearable. This is getting too tiring, she finished, as if my life here was just an inconvenience to her plans. I live with my mother-in-law, but now she wants me to leave home because her eldest son, my son-in-law, and his wife are coming back. This house seems to be consumed by problems, and I feel trapped in this maelstrom of conflict. My mother-in-law, my son-in-law, his wife, and my husband. This house is full of people, but there is little heat. I tried to make everything go smoothly, look for compromises, sacrificed myself for the sake of peace, but the thought that nothing was changing became unbearable for me. That's it, I'm done, I thought, as if drawing a line. Okay, I finally said, I'll leave. But I can't just leave my stuff in the yard. I added with a touch of bitterness, knowing that my words had been ignored. My mother-in-law looked at me, a faint tinge of satisfaction breaking through the cold mask of indifference. Are you leaving? Thank you, it's a great help, she said on the move, ignoring my request. I silently began to pack my things, feeling a wave of despair and fatigue spread through my body. It's only been 7 seconds since I walked out the door, but it feels like an eternity inside me. I took out my phone and called the garbage collection service, taking it as another step towards my new life. I couldn't let anyone stop me anymore. My life had to change, and this was only the first step. My name is Carol, I am 43 years old. I am an IT consultant, and my husband Patrick, who is also 43, runs 4 restaurants. We are both 43, and people often assume that we have been married for a long time, that we have children, but in fact we are just new friends, so to speak. We both worked for years, barely noticing life outside of work, until a chance visit to a bar changed my view of everything. Is this your first time here? Patrick asked that evening. His smile was warmer than the whole stylish interior, which previously seemed inaccessible to me. I also used to work with restaurants, and that's when I suggested implementing an order system on tablets. The idea was to reduce labor costs and increase efficiency by improving customer service. This system, which has now become almost commonplace in the world of the restaurant business, seemed innovative at the time. Patrick, interested and eager to innovate, asked me, how much will it cost for a place like mine? I thought for a moment, took out my phone and started typing numbers into the calculator. About that much, I said, showing him the calculation screen. But Patrick, surprised and slightly shocked, shook his head vigorously. No way, this is too much for a small business like mine, he said with animated gestures, as if trying to find a way to make sense of what he had heard. His sincere surprise did not prevent him from showing interest and continuing to study. He was curious, eager to develop his business and put new knowledge into practice. Our conversations were never just empty conversations. His thirst for growth and improvement was felt in each of them. It was his dedication, his passion for business and his desire to learn that gradually began to attract me. It soon became clear that Patrick loved me not only for my professional skills, but also for the fact that I, like him, was immersed in work. He saw that I was hardworking and constant employment left me almost no time for my personal life. One day, during our next conversation, Patrick unexpectedly suggested, how about we go out for dinner? I was filled with excitement at the thought. Of course, I replied, hiding my genuine joy behind a slight smile. I was really excited about the opportunity to spend the evening having dinner with Patrick. In my heart, I felt like a girl being asked out for the first time, but to say something like that at almost 43 years old would seem awkward. I decided not to attach any importance to this, leaving everything as it is. But Patrick did not limit himself to one invitation. He continued to invite me to lunches and dinners from time to time, and gradually our meetings turned into something more. We became more than just colleagues or dinner friends. Romance was born between us. Our relationship, as adult men and women, seemed simple and calm at first, but over time it turned into something deep and meaningful. 3 years later, when we both turned 43, we decided to get married. I was a little embarrassed when I imagined myself as a bride at that age. In my heart, I still felt a slight tremor before this step, although I knew that our marriage was the result of mature, balanced decisions. When Patrick offered to arrange the wedding, I asked him to skip the ceremony. It was enough for us to just take a few photos after the marriage. Without unnecessary formalities, we joined our lives and moved into Patrick's house together. This house was magnificent, a 4-story building with a garden and ample parking, located in one of the prestigious areas. The rent for it was about $22,000 per month. However, Patrick did not live there alone. His mother lived with him. Someone might find it unthinkable to live with my mother-in-law immediately after the wedding, but I was 43 years old, and this aspect did not seem to be a problem to me. I understood that his mother, who is already 71 years old, needed care, especially since his father died a long time ago. Living together seemed less like a sacrifice than a necessity. When Patrick asked me to live with his mother, I didn't hesitate to say that it was fine with me. But as soon as I moved into the house, I quickly regretted my hasty agreement. The house was too big, and although I got a separate office to work in, the atmosphere in it was tense from the very beginning. "Why do we need such a big house just for you and your mother?" I asked one day, looking at the spacious, empty rooms. Patrick explained to me that he has an older brother, Stephen, who is 4 years older than him. Stephen left home after college, and they've almost lost touch ever since. He rarely came home, and it had been many years since Patrick had heard of him. He's the kind of person who can get into trouble and come back to my mom and me. "That's why we decided to rent a bigger house," he said, trying to explain the logic of this decision. I thought maybe the house was really too big for two, but now that we're married, everything seems justified. Patrick told me about his brother with a smile as he unpacked my books and put them on the shelves. He spoke of Stephen with warmth and a touch of nostalgia, even though they barely spoke. But unlike Patrick, his mother did not feel the same way about her eldest son. "Don't talk about him as a child," I heard a voice behind me. His mother, my mother-in-law, was standing in the doorway of my office, clearly following our conversations. There was something else in her eyes. She clearly did not share a warm attitude towards Stephen and made it clear more than once. It is clear that a mother is cold towards her eldest son, who shirks his duties, but this worried me. I was worried that my husband, Patrick, and his mother might one day quarrel over his brother Stephen. It seemed that her mother-in-law's grievances, accumulated over the years, could flare up at any moment, destroying their fragile family balance. "And I don't love you too much, Mom," Patrick protested softly, trying to restrain himself, although it was obvious that he was offended by his mother's words. "But we're living together now, so let's stop saying things like that." He tried to calm her down in a tone that usually worked. "I'm not saying that you should leave," the mother-in-law quickly replied, her voice becoming cold and aloof. "I just needed to clarify the situation from the beginning." With that, she walked away, leaving behind the slapping sound of her slippers on the wooden floor. The sound echoed in the room for a long time, as if reminding her of her unspoken displeasure. "I'm sorry," Patrick said, sighing heavily. "I'll talk to her." He tried to smile, but I could see how hard it was for him. "It's okay," I tried to be reassuring, although I was worried internally. "We've already discussed this at the wedding. I'll build a relationship with your mom while we live together." I picked up the book he was holding and carefully put it on the shelf. Patrick looked at me gratefully, but I knew his mind was elsewhere. My mother-in-law didn't seem to approve of my age. I am 43, and although the possibility of having children has not yet been ruled out, I realized that this prospect was becoming less real every year. In her eyes, maybe I wasn't playing the role she expected from her son's wife. Moreover, the eldest son Stephen is not married and has no children, which only increased her disappointment. She could be upset not only that Patrick married someone older, but also that her eldest son did not fulfill his role at all. I understood her pain, but of course I couldn't change my age. When the move was completed and our family life began to take shape, my mother-in-law's coldness towards me became more and more noticeable. She ignored me when I spoke, trying to avoid even accidental collisions. I was a little lonely, but since she did not harass me directly and did not show aggression, I tried not to aggravate the situation, convincing myself that I could eventually establish a relationship with her. I was most worried about Patrick. "Are you okay with your job?" I asked one day at dinner, noticing his depressed look. "No, it's not good," he replied, lowering his head. "We need to take measures, and the sooner the better, but finances are difficult to cope with." Patrick was sitting at the table, holding his head in his hands, and looked as if an enormous weight was hanging on his shoulders. I immediately stopped washing the dishes and sat down in front of him to listen carefully. Times are hard. Prices are rising, costs are rising, and customers are saving more and more. There is no end in sight. If this goes on, we may have to close another store. His voice was low, almost subdued. About a year after our wedding, the situation in his restaurants really worsened. One of the 4 stores had already had to close, and it seemed that the second one could also suffer the same fate. I saw Patrick's worried face and felt my stomach clench with anxiety. But my mother-in-law didn't seem to share our problems. "You're his wife, but you're not helping out at the store, you're just doing your job. Can you really say that you are fulfilling your role as a wife?" Her sharp voice came from the living room. She seemed to be eavesdropping on our conversation, and her words were full of reproaches. I glanced at Patrick, trying to figure out how he would react, but he was silent, looking down at the table. I wondered what she really thought of me, but her words didn't just affect me. They dealt with the deep topic of family responsibilities, which, in her opinion, I clearly did not fulfill. "You, his wife, should not make such a face," the mother-in-law continued. "You're only fueling his anxiety. You make him feel like a loser. What a terrible wife." She was shouting from the living room, as if her words were supposed to shatter my confidence into small pieces. Her voice was full of anger, but I knew there was something more behind these attacks. She wasn't just trying to prick me. However, despite her harsh statements, I couldn't help but notice that there was some truth in her words. I took her words as a challenge, not to humiliate myself, but, on the contrary, to become a support for Patrick. Deciding that I would support him even more from now on, I gave him an encouraging smile. A year later, incredible as it may seem, the situation has changed. Patrick managed to overcome the difficulties and avoid closing the second store, as if fate had decided to support his efforts. My mother-in-law, of course, did not recognize this success to my merits, but I knew that, despite her harsh words, it was Patrick and me supporting each other that helped him cope with these trials. "You see, I told you that a stupid wife who can't even trust her husband doesn't pull Patrick down." My mother-in-law sat in an armchair like a queen on a throne. Her gaze pierced me like an icy wind. Her words were laced with disdain and obvious pleasure that she could prick me again. But this time I didn't even try to object. Nothing she said could have hurt me more than the events that have already unfolded in our lives. Since Patrick's business has stabilized, his confidence has increased markedly, and with that confidence came the rumors. I heard from friends that Patrick might have had an affair. At first I didn't want to believe it, I waved it off, telling myself that it was just gossip. But when the money started disappearing from our accounts faster than it was coming in, I began to suspect the worst. If he really had an affair on the side, then what kind of money did he spend on it? We had just started to get back on our feet after the crisis, and suddenly it turned out that he was looking for other entertainment. What could have distracted him so much? But before I could confront him with these thoughts, a new problem loomed on the horizon: Stephen. One evening, Patrick returned home with a serious face. I immediately felt that something had happened, and my assumptions were confirmed when he said, "Stephen called. His girlfriend is pregnant." "That's great news." I tried to cheer him up, although everything turned upside down in my soul. Strangely enough, the idea that Stephen, this flighty, irresponsible man, was going to become a father suddenly seemed disturbing to me. I didn't even have time to get to know him, and then all of a sudden this news. "She worked in the same bar as me," Patrick added, looking away as if avoiding my gaze. "Did they ask you something?" I asked, feeling that there was a part of the story that hadn't been told yet. "They want to move here," he said softly, almost in a whisper, as if he knew that this request would bring no joy to either me or him. "They're struggling with money, and Stephen asked if they could live with us. And work in my restaurant." I sighed heavily, feeling the tension building inside. It all sounded like trouble slowly creeping up on us. But before I could express my opinion, my mother-in-law entered the room. Her presence instantly changed the atmosphere. Only yesterday she had spoken of Stephen with contempt for the fact that he had never fulfilled his role as the eldest son. But today, after hearing about her future grandson, her tone was completely different. "Patrick, you have to invite Stephen back," she began, and there was a new note of hope in her voice. The hope that she had lost a long time ago now flared up with renewed vigor. All for the sake of the grandson. She seemed ready to change all her previous beliefs for this chance. It was almost impossible for Patrick to reject it. His mother, who had previously not recognized any merit for Stephen, now offered to give him a house and a job herself. I saw my husband's face darken with worry, but he just sighed and nodded in agreement. "Yes, I understand," he said, giving up. His gaze slid to me, and I caught a hint of guilt in his eyes, as if he knew he couldn't resist his mother's pressure. In the evening, when I was going to discuss with Patrick the rumors about his possible betrayal, it became impossible. All my thoughts were occupied by new problems: the deterioration of relations with my mother-in-law, Stephen's move with his family, and the fact that now a whole whirlpool of changes awaits us. The problems were piling up like threatening clouds, and I didn't know where to start. The feeling of overload filled every cell of my being. I decided to postpone all conversations and just go to bed. The next day was a weekend, but from emotional fatigue I slept until late in the morning. When I finally got up, Patrick was already at work, leaving me alone at home with his mother. I knew that a conversation with her was inevitable, and I didn't want to hear her reproach me for not doing my job again. Gathering my thoughts, I reluctantly headed into the living room, already prepared for her usual attacks. But what I heard turned out to be much worse. "You probably overheard our conversation with Patrick yesterday, right?" She began coldly as soon as I appeared on the doorstep. I just nodded, feeling that I did not want to continue this dialogue, but she already continued. "Stephen and his wife are returning on maternity leave, and since they will live here, put your things in the yard. You'll have to make room." I froze, realizing the meaning of her words. "Into the courtyard?" I asked, as if I couldn't believe my ears. It seemed like she really meant that I didn't belong in this house. "You can't have children anyway, and you're not helping Patrick with his job. So you should at least make room for Stephen and his family," the mother-in-law spoke calmly, but there was finality in her voice. The words lashed out like a whip, painfully and irrevocably. She didn't even bother to soften the blow by saying it to my face, as if the fact had long been decided and my role here was complete. "We have 2 spare rooms left. If you leave and your office is free, we can make one of them a bedroom for Stephen and his wife, and the other a nursery. And the storeroom for their things, of course. Don't you think this is the perfect solution?" She finally fell silent, and I stood in painful silence, feeling my entire existence begin to shrink to the limit. I was not just asked, I was pushed out. I was superfluous in this house, where now they were going to find a place for a new family, where a long-awaited grandson would appear, for whom my mother-in-law was ready to sacrifice everything, even my presence. I felt a dull, internal resistance growing, as if my whole world had suddenly become alien, and I was asked to leave it as unnecessary. My mother-in-law did not even see me as a person. Her gaze had long been fixed on the future, in which I did not occupy a single line. I thought about how Patrick and I paid the rent on this house. I invested not only money in it, but also my soul, believing that this is the beginning of a new chapter in our lives. $20,000 flashed through my head, but immediately let go. Money didn't mean anything anymore when the relationship crumbled before our eyes. I'm too tired, I suddenly realized, no longer finding the strength to even fight for my right to be here. Clearing my mind and not getting into further arguments was the only thing left for me. I didn't mind. It was pointless trying to convince anyone of his worth when every breath here proved otherwise. The ticking of the clock broke the silence of the living room as I stood, silent and motionless. As time passed, my mother-in-law didn't even seem to be waiting for my answer. She just accepted the fact that I would leave. It's time to leave, I said to myself, clenching my last sense of dignity in my fists. I'm leaving tonight. I will make room for the future they so passionately want to build, without me. The next morning, I started packing my things. My mother-in-law silently watched my actions. Her face was stony. She didn't need to say anything else. She had already won. I packed up all my things, put them out in the yard, and when I pulled out the last box, I just said softly, "I'm leaving." Her sigh of relief was barely audible, but I felt it with my whole being. On the same day, I called the garbage collection service. All the things that I had left in the restaurant, from the equipment to the furniture, now had no value for me. Let everything disappear, just like my life in this house. Leaving the restaurant empty, I wanted it to become a symbol. They may regret this decision later, but I won't look back. I rented a small apartment and lived alone for 3 weeks. Patrick didn't call, didn't try to find me. He probably thought I'd come back. I always did when the situation seemed hopeless. But this time I wasn't going back. 3 weeks later, the phone rang. Patrick was on the other side, his voice agitated. "What's going on with the restaurant?" "I came in the morning, and that's it. It's empty." "Where are the refrigerators and equipment? Why is there nothing?" I felt as if I had finally taken control of the situation. "Patrick," I said quietly but confidently, "I could explain everything to you over the phone. But I think it would be better for you if you talk to your mother about it when you get home." I hung up the phone without waiting for his answer. Patrick was in shock, and it gave me a strange feeling of relief, even a slight joy. For the first time in a long time, I did what was needed for me and not for him. When I returned home, my mother-in-law was literally seething with anger. She screamed at me, demanding an explanation. "What does this mean? Refrigerators? Tables? All the most important things for the restaurant's operation have disappeared." I calmly replied, "This is my restaurant. And if I decide to start the closing process, I think I have every right to do so." The mother-in-law froze, looking at Patrick, as if unable to comprehend what she had just heard. Her face expressed a mixture of bewilderment and anger, as if her familiar world had suddenly been shaken. "Why don't you explain, Patrick?" Her voice became strained, almost hissing. "You didn't tell me what she was." "That Carol owns a second restaurant." Patrick sighed heavily, as if every breath was an effort. "I wanted to say, Mom," he began, avoiding her gaze, but the situation was difficult. The second branch was on the verge of collapse, and, yes, Carol helped me. She didn't just give me the money, she actually bought the rights to this restaurant." The mother-in-law seemed unable to make ends meet. "What? What are you talking about? You always said you were working day and night to rebuild the restaurant. I thought it was your success, your work." I stepped closer, deciding to intervene. "Let me explain everything as it really was," I said firmly, but not defiantly. "Before I turned 43, I was single and worked for a consulting company for many years. When Patrick and I got married, we didn't have a wedding ceremony or a new home. But I had savings, $400,000, which I invested in the restaurant when Patrick needed the money. My mother-in-law seemed stunned. Did you lend Patrick $400,000? But how can you just give away such a huge amount of money? It wasn't just like that, I continued without losing my composure. I couldn't afford to risk that kind of money, so I decided to become the official owner of the second branch. Patrick continued to run the restaurant, but, in fact, it was already my business. That's what helped him get out of the crisis. My mother-in-law stared at Patrick in amazement, as if trying to find confirmation of my words. Is that true, Patrick? Yes, Mom, he replied softly. Carol said that if I couldn't do it, she wouldn't blame me. But to protect her money, she offered to become the owner of the restaurant. But why didn't you tell me anything? Her voice became choked, as if she was just now beginning to realize the depth of what was happening. You've always said that you believe in your business, that everything is going according to plan. Mom, I didn't want to disappoint you. Patrick lowered his head. You always set high expectations for me, and I felt that pressure. I wanted to do it on my own. I wanted to prove that I could. But the situation was too complicated and I couldn't handle it without help. I put the documents on the table, agreements on the transfer of business rights and the lease of the restaurant. The papers rustled loudly, as if confirming the weight of these years. My mother-in-law slowly picked up one of the pages, and her eyes widened when she saw my name in the owner's column. Why did you hide this from me, Patrick? Her voice trembled as if she was standing on the edge of a precipice. Mom, I knew you'd be upset, Patrick replied, avoiding a direct answer. You've always set such high standards for me. I couldn't tell you that I had to take the money from Carol, otherwise you would have felt that I had failed you as a son. The mother-in-law fell silent, an inner struggle was visible on her face. Her pride made it difficult for her to acknowledge reality, but at the same time it was difficult for her to ignore the facts. She took a deep breath, as if gathering her strength for the next question. Patrick, I just wanted you to be successful. You always said you could handle it. Her voice was not so stern anymore, there was something like regret in it. But why didn't you trust me? Patrick looked at her, finally deciding to answer. Mom, I always knew that you wanted the best for me. But your expectations were there, too high. I didn't mean to let you down, but every time you praised me for my success, I felt like I couldn't afford to make a mistake. You've always been strict, Patrick continued, especially towards people like Stephen who didn't follow your ideas of what an eldest son should be. I was afraid to disappoint you, that's why I didn't tell you the truth about how Carol helped me. My mother-in-law quietly lowered her head, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the edge of the table. I didn't realize that I was creating such pressure, she whispered, as if speaking more to herself than to us. Patrick stood in front of me, stunned. His gaze darted from the divorce papers I put on the table to the image on his smartphone, a picture taken by one of the restaurant's part-time employees. It was a photo of him and a woman leaving the hotel next to the restaurant. He stared at the screen for a few more seconds as if he couldn't believe his eyes, and then, in a trembling voice, he said, What does it mean? Why divorce? We've just started to get things right. We've made up, right? Patrick, you shouldn't be under any illusions, I replied coldly. The fact that you decided to turn a blind eye to the problems in our lives does not mean that they do not exist. I know about your affair with an employee. All the part-time workers knew about it, it's just that no one told me directly until I started suspecting myself. Patrick swallowed, his face turning pale. He knew that I had nothing more to explain. His attempts to hide the truth and blindly hope for business recovery could not obscure the fact of his betrayal. It's just a rumor, he managed. You can't make such accusations without evidence. I picked up the phone and showed him the image again. It's not a rumor, Patrick. These are the proofs. The photo was taken by one of the employees. Don't you think people in the restaurant notice everything? As soon as I started asking questions, they immediately supported me and began to help me. They even hid the fact of the restaurant closing from you until I received all the necessary documents. Patrick took a shuddering breath, and then fell into a chair, as if his legs could no longer hold him. He still didn't fully believe in what was happening, and there was still a shadow of hope in his eyes. My mother-in-law sat motionless, as if petrified. Her hands were shaking as she looked up at Patrick and said, "What did you do, Patrick? You really are. Did you cheat on Carol?" Patrick, avoiding her gaze, lowered his head and muttered something unintelligible. My mother-in-law looked like the whole world had suddenly collapsed on her, and everything she thought was true had crumbled to pieces. She looked at me, her eyes full of pain and confusion. "Carol," she started to speak, but her voice was choking. I never wanted it to come to this. If only I knew, if only. I didn't put that much pressure on either of you." "That's not the point," I interrupted her, although I knew that she might finally be beginning to realize her role in what was happening. "There is pressure, but this does not explain the betrayal. Patrick made this decision himself. And now this decision has led us to the fact that I am putting the divorce papers on the table." Patrick grabbed the papers again, turning the pages in desperation. "Wait a minute. What about the rent on the house?" he asked, trying to seize any opportunity to save our position. "You're not just going to leave everything, are you? How will we pay?" I took a deep breath, feeling tired from this conversation. "I've been paying all the rent for a long time, Patrick. You know that very well. $20,000 a month is the amount you couldn't cover. You knew that I was paying it out of my savings. When the restaurant started to lose profit, at first I paid half, but when things got really bad, I had to take over the entire amount. This is exactly how much I earn in a month. And all other expenses, food, utilities, we covered together. But if we get divorced, it won't matter anymore. I'm not going to pay for a house I won't live in anymore." The mother-in-law, still in shock, whispered softly, "Patrick, is this true? Did you let Carol pay the entire rent? How could you?" "Yes, Mom," he finally said without looking up. "The restaurant was not profitable, and we could not cope otherwise. Carol helped, she always helped. But that's as much as you earn," she repeated, shocked. "And now, if only the main restaurant remains, you won't be able to live here anymore." Patrick shook his head nervously, and tears glistened in his eyes. Patrick and my mother-in-law sat devastated, their faces expressing the bitterness of disappointment. It seemed that each of them was experiencing his own personal defeat in his own way, as if after a long and exhausting boxing match. They had exhausted themselves, their energy had faded, and now all that remained was a silent admission of their own collapse. Meanwhile, Stephen and his wife, who had only recently returned to the house, were also beginning to realize the depth of the situation. Hesitantly, they entered into conversation. Stephen, smiling nervously, asked, "What do you mean, we came back here and now we can't live here?" His voice was trembling, clearly feeling that this was not the conversation he was expecting. His wife, who had been quietly watching the development of events, timidly tried to say something, but her words, like dust in the wind, quickly dissipated before the general tension. "Wait, Stephen. That's not what we've heard. We thought that as soon as we got home, everything would be fine," she apologized, her voice full of uncertainty. "Right now I don't have the funds to help you with either the restaurant or the house," I added, realizing that the situation was getting worse. "We're going to have a baby, Stephen," his wife continued anxiously. "At least help me with my job." "A job?" Patrick sighed, barely looking up at his brother. "Now we are cutting costs, laying off employees who were part-time. I will work hard myself to somehow stabilize the situation. I don't have any new job for you." "Hey, what about home and work?" Stephen burst out, his voice rising an octave, and now he was shouting at Patrick, who in turn looked even more depressed. His wife stood by, still silent, as if she couldn't find a place in this argument that was inexorably heating up between the brothers. My mother-in-law, tired and confused, just looked at her sons as if everything that was happening was beyond her comprehension. She didn't know how to intervene or what to say to end this storm. I felt that my participation in this conversation had been exhausted. I didn't want to try to smooth things over with Patrick or his family anymore. All this struggle for harmony in relationships, for a home, for a business, all this burned me out from the inside. Now that I had informed them of the divorce and the closure of the restaurant, I could leave knowing that I had done everything I could. This was my last step in this complicated story. I got up, hearing the screams getting louder behind me, and left the house without turning around. They could now discuss their future among themselves. The house stopped bothering me, it was their problem, and I no longer wanted to participate in their arguments. The divorce from Patrick went smoothly, thanks to the irrefutable evidence of his infidelity. I could have demanded alimony, but I didn't need it. I had a stable job, and I didn't want any more connections with Patrick or his family. My decision to refuse compensation was conscious. The less contact with the past, the better. After our divorce, Patrick found himself in a deep hole. He couldn't afford the rent on the house we once shared and had to move out. Financial and emotional stress destroyed his family. My mother-in-law, whom he hoped for, could not help either. Her own strength had run out. Patrick claimed that taking care of his mother was the responsibility of his older brother, Stephen. However, Stephen, who returned with nothing, was also unable to take on such responsibility. This led to a monstrous quarrel between the brothers, which finally broke off their relationship. Stephen and his wife disappeared again, as if they had disappeared into thin air, ending all contact. They couldn't stand the conflict they witnessed. My former mother-in-law was trapped between her sons, but none of them wanted or could take responsibility for her future. Now Patrick lived with his mother in a small apartment, modest and far from the comfort and spaciousness that had once been in their lives. They hardly spoke, despite the fact that they now lived together. This quiet tension in their relationship turned their home into a cold, empty place where everyone hid their feelings behind walls of silence. My decision to end my marriage, close the restaurant and leave everything behind led to the destruction of my family, but it also gave me freedom. Closing the restaurant wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. I was able to sell all the equipment at a good price, which helped to cover some of the costs and complete this stage of my life. Although I was the owner for a short time, this experience gave me important lessons that may one day be useful in my work in the field of IT consulting. Now I knew that work suited me better than marriage. Having made sure of this, I continued to work hard, building my new, independent life.